to come back and be with our church family and to be in an atmosphere that can help fill up our spiritual gas tanks, if you will. And so I appreciate you all being here. I know it's a little challenge sometimes on a Wednesday night to be here, but I appreciate the effort, and I hope that you feel rewarded for taking the time to be here. So I want to say thanks also to our pastor to give me the opportunity to share some things that I think are really significant. I have been learning a lot as I've been teaching, and I want to share some of that with you. Last week, Pastor talked about the law of pain. And so what I'm doing is kind of following that up a little bit in what I'm talking about, and share with you a little bit about what we've been studying in our class, Where is God When It Hurts? You know, when we started out the quarter and we're looking at the classes and so on, I was looking at the name of the class, Where is God When It Hurts? And I knew that I was kind of taking a risk, or it felt like that anyway, to know if anybody was going to come to a class with that kind of name to it. You know, we don't always volunteer to go into places where it seems like it's going to be a downer. But I'm really thankful that I've had a very dedicated, faithful class of people, and I think we've been learning some really awesome things. So I want to share some of those with you. I was excited about the class to begin with before we started the quarter. But as I've gotten into the material and as we've studied it, that excitement has grown as I have learned more and have begun to understand this process that we're talking about. How do we go through these difficulties in our lives? So we've been exploring the whole idea of how do we respond to pain and suffering in our lives when it enters our lives. It's not a particularly fun thing to talk about, but it's so necessary because we all experience it. It's not a matter of if pain will enter your life. It's a matter of when. And so it's a universal experience. We all have our moments, past and present, both of intense pain and suffering, and even frequent experience sometimes with loss and frustration and disappointments and rejections. And when those things happen, we all look for answers. Where is God in the middle of all of this? Where are you, God? If he's there, does he really care? Sometimes we even ask, what did I do wrong to deserve this? Is God punishing me for something? Maybe I didn't read my Bible enough last week, and that's why this has happened. So we have questions that we ask in those experiences. I imagine if we were able to go around the room, we could all tell story after story about our own Job kind of experiences. The big storms, the tsunamis that come into our lives very unexpectedly, or even just the times of the smaller turbulence in our lives. Every one of us has them. And some of those times, hopefully, we've been able to come through fairly well and relatively intact. Other times in those experiences, perhaps we didn't respond quite as well, and sometimes they still negatively affect us. Just as the pain in this fallen world is inevitable, our response to it is not. One of humankind's greatest blessings is free choice. And like I say, one of humankind's greatest curses is also free choice. We have a choice of how we're going to respond when these storms come up in our lives. And I'm sure we could all come up pretty easily with different ways that we ourselves and other people, things that we've witnessed, different ways that people have responded in these kinds of circumstances. And I truly believe that since it says, the Bible says it rains on the just and the unjust, right? And we all experience these things that we, as Christians, should have a noticeably different way of responding in these situations than unbelievers. Do you agree with me? We should be able to show a different way of responding. What a witness that can be to unbelievers. But the question is, how do we do that? And that's part of what we've been talking about in the class. None of us likes the idea of pain or suffering and loss. None of us wakes up in the morning and says, gee, I'd like some pain today. We just don't do it. We would much rather believe that life is good and that good things will happen to us if we are good, and that bad things only happen to bad people. Isn't that what we'd rather believe? But our experience just does not prove that to be true, does it? In his book, The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis says this: we want not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, whose plan for the universe was such that it might be said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. I should very much like to live in a universe which was governed on such lines. But since it is abundantly clear that I don't, and since I have reason to believe, nevertheless, that God is love, I conclude that my conception of love needs correction. Now, I've pondered that statement a good bit, and as I've thought about it, it really has become very meaningful to me, because often our idea of what love is so limited that we don't understand what real love is and the great depth and width of God's love. We measure or gauge love by our own human experience, and God's love is far beyond that. Our idea of love is usually about doing good, caring things for those we love, right? That's certainly part of it. We want to take care of them. We don't want them to go through hard times or hurt. We want to protect them. And haven't you felt that way as parents? We don't want our babies to hurt, do we? No matter how old they get, we don't want them to hurt. But the widest, deepest kind of God's love also recognizes that sometimes hard times and pain are the only things that really help us learn what we need to learn. They are often our wake-up call. C.S. Lewis calls pain God's megaphone. That kind of love is what can step in when at some point, as a parent, with a teenager who is being disrespectful and irresponsible, we step in and say, okay, that's it. You're grounded from the car for the next 10 years, and you can't date until you're 30. Okay? That's the kind of real love that helps teach. God's deepest and kindest and widest kind of love also recognizes that we, fallen human beings who love to be self-sufficient and in control, only learn what we need to learn when pain and loss enter our lives. What would happen to us as a people, as a society, if we were really able to completely eliminate pain and the experience of it in our lives? What would that do to us socially or emotionally or spiritually? Graham Greene wrote this in his book, The Third Man. He said, in Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, bloodshed, but it produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. He said in Switzerland they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. The idea of trying to unravel this whole idea of mystery of pain and suffering has occupied many, many minds since Adam and Eve were driven out of the garden. Much has been written and much has been discussed and analyzed, trying to figure it all out. And we, civilized human beings, have many, many different ideas of what pain is and our concepts and our ideas and our beliefs about it. And it can be very confusing sometimes to think about and to experience. If you think of an example of pain and suffering, who do you think of first? Most of us think of Job. Pastor talked about Job last week. How many of you ever felt like you really identified with Job at some time in your life with the experiences? I think probably most of us have in one way or another. You know, the wisdom book of Job was written earlier than any other book in the Bible. Yet the questions that he voiced in that book so eloquently are questions that are still being asked and still being discussed even today, and even are getting louder and more demanding for answers today. It's very interesting to see the progression of thought and the perspective on this whole subject in looking at many of the books written about pain and suffering over many years in time. You can basically divide them into two groups. There are early books who are written by theologians and authors like Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Bunyan, Donne, Luther, Calvin. They wholeheartedly accepted the idea of pain and suffering as just a part of life. That's just how life was. And so in these books, they didn't question God's actions in it. It's just how life is. They simply tried to justify the ways of God to man. Philip Yancey wrote this. He says that these early authors wrote with such confidence as if by sheer force of their reasoning, they could calm emotional responses to suffering. But the more modern books on pain take a whole different approach and are in a sharp contrast to those early books. These newer authors generally assume that the amount of evil and suffering in the world can't be matched with the traditional idea of a loving and good God. They said there's too much evil and too much suffering in the world. We can't fit that with the idea of a good and loving God. So they basically have bumped God from a friend of the court position and put him in the box reserved for the defendant. They essentially have put God on trial. And they say, God, how can you possibly justify yourself for these kinds of things continuing to happen? Many of them have adjusted their notion of God by either redefining his love, in other words, he's not really that loving, or by questioning his power to control evil. In other words, he's really not all that powerful. One of the more recent books, and a very popular one, was written and published in 2004. It is called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Any of you ever heard of that? By Rabbi Harold Kushner. It's interesting because he wrote this book after one of his children was born with a disease called progeria, which is a rapid aging and early death disease. And in going through this process with his son, he decided that basically the world had so much evil in it, God wasn't powerful enough to control it or to stop it. He didn't conclude there wasn't a God, just that God was overpowered by the evil and couldn't control it. Now, see, that's an example of what a lot of people are reading these days and getting their theology from. Now, my way of thinking, a God who's not powerful enough to manage evil in this world is not the one that I see in the Bible. And it's not the one that I want to worship, because my God is powerful. My God is sovereign, and my God is in control. As it turns out, the majority of these books on pain are often irrelevant to people in their time of suffering. Because when we are suffering, the problem of pain is not a theoretical one, that we need to line up our beliefs and how do we see this and how do we view this. It essentially becomes a relationship problem at that point. When we're suffering and things have happened in our lives, we generally want to understand and we want to love God, but we can't see past our own tears and our own fears to know how to do that. we feel hurt, and we feel betrayed. And even more sadly, when we need hope and help the most, sometimes the church doesn't give very clear or helpful answers itself. In times of suffering, ours or someone else's, we often spend a lot of time and energy trying to find the answer to a backward-looking question, why? Looking back, why is this happening? We try to figure out if God is punishing us, what we did wrong, that this has happened to us, or like Job's friends, we point a finger at our friends and say, wow, you must really have sinned for this to have happened to you. Instead of looking at the backward-looking question of why, we need to begin to look at the forward-looking question of to what end? What will be the end result of my going through this experience? The truth is, we are not on earth merely to satisfy our own needs and our own desires and our happiness. We are here to be changed. We're here to be more like him. We're here to learn to be more like Jesus and prepare ourselves for a lifetime with him. That's the idea here. We are to learn how to overcome this sin nature that we were born into and obediently and humbly take on his nature. That's a challenge, isn't it? In these hard times, we as Christians almost walk a kind of mental tightrope. And we're in constant danger of falling in one or two different directions here. There are two common errors that we can fall into when we're thinking about this whole idea of pain and suffering. The first error comes when we attribute all suffering to God, seeing it as his punishment for human mistakes. That's one error at one extreme. I remember, as I was thinking about this, I remember when I was in second grade. So I was about 6 years old. And one morning, the music teacher came in. And she proceeded to say she had a cold and she didn't feel good. And she'd been trying to figure out what she had done wrong for God to make her have a cold. Imagine saying that to a room of second graders. But that's some of the theology and some of the error people fall into when they're thinking about this whole idea. No wonder we get some mixed up theology, right? The second error does just the opposite of that, and it assumes that life with God will never include suffering, with the health and wealth and prosperity doctrine that people preach. And that teaches that God's will for believers is always to be prosperous, always to be victorious and healthy, no matter what. And anything that's not that is always from Satan and never God's will. Those are the two extremes that we try to sometimes fall into. But much of the suffering on our planet has come about because of two principles that God built into creation. The first is a physical world that operates according to consistent natural laws. The earth, as set in motion, operates according to these fixed laws. The second principle is human freedom, our choice. So by committing to those two principles, both good principles in themselves, God allowed for the possibility of their abuse. For example, water in its liquid state is something that we need, right? We need water personally to survive. Our planet needs water to survive. But water is also something we can drown in, right? Or we could drown somebody else in. So something that's good could be used for evil. Wood, just the trunk of a tree, supports the fruit and the leaves, provides shade and all those kinds of good things, builds houses, buildings. But it can also be set on fire and cause destruction. So good things can be used and perverted for evil because of these principles. And those are some of the things that God has set in motion here. J.I. Packer said this: there is an umbrella word that we use to cover the countless variety of situations that have this character, namely suffering. Suffering may conveniently be defined as getting what you do not want while wanting what you do not get. This definition covers all forms of loss, hurt, pain, grief, and weakness, all experiences of rejection, injustice, disappointment, discouragement, frustration, and being the butt of others' hatred, ridicule, cruelty, callousness, anger, and ill treatment, plus all exposure to foul, sickening, and nightmarish things that can make you want to scream, run, or even die. Ease is for heaven, not earth. Life on earth is fundamentally out of shape and out of order by reason of sin. So strains, pains, disappointments, traumas, and frustrations of all sort await us in the future, just as they have already overtaken us in the past. The truth is that we live in a fallen world, and it often falls on us. When it does, the weight of the world crushes us and can squeeze the life right out of us. And in those times, we need hope. We need a new life, we need a resuscitated heart, and we need a resurrected life. And that's been kind of our goal as we've been walking through this class for the quarter. We've been looking at a process to help us learn how to discover that new life and the new hope in the midst of suffering. I believe that God has given the church, which is us, it's not the building, He's given us, the people, a mandate of representing His real love to a suffering world. Wouldn't you agree? That's part of our goal. That's part of our challenge here. We usually think of the problem of pain as a question we ask of God, but it's also a question He asks of us. It's not how do we, as His body, respond to hurting people. It's not just a matter of when we ourselves are hurting, but how do we reach out to our fellow believers and people around us who may not be believers when they are hurting? How do we reach out to them, and how do we minister to them? You know, interesting thing I read today, the Chinese language is made up of symbols. And the symbol in the Chinese language for the word we call crisis is made up of two other symbols. It's the symbol of danger, and it's the symbol of opportunity. So they put those two symbols together. And in our danger or in our crisis, we have opportunity. Jesus Himself promised that life would be filled with losses, right? Pastor used this verse last week. John 16:33 says, "And in the world ye shall have tribulation." What does that mean? Tribulation. Trouble. Plain and simple. That's both internal and external suffering and trouble. External suffering is things like illness and poverty and disease and criticism, abandonment, death. Those are external circumstances. But we also have internal suffering with our fear, our anxiety, our anguish, depression, grief. Those are internal experiences. We aren't promised to stroll through the park in this life. I mean, that's what we'd rather have, right? But that's not what we're promised, and that's one of the problems. We want the stroll through the park. Because of that, we see pain as our enemy, and we see it as being in the way to the pleasure that we want. That's what we would prefer. So we don't expect the pain, and we definitely don't want it. But the truth is, we must learn not to just talk about over and over about our pains and our hurts. But we need to be able to talk about and deal with them in the context of God's healing. Not just rehearsing what's happened and what's going on, but in the context of how can God heal this? How can we work through this? How can we avail ourselves of the opportunity that this circumstance gives us? And that's what brings us hope. That's what brings the healing and the freedom. And we can make our painful experiences a creative force in our lives rather than a destructive one. Remember? Free choice. We have a choice about how we respond. Too often when we hear about or talk about pain and suffering in our life or somebody else's, we hear a lot of kind of Pollyanna kind of talk about it. Much of it's very superficial, well-meaning perhaps, but cliched and not very helpful. Some people try to do the happiness all the time, wonderful peace of mind no matter what's going on. A lot of times we hear kind of cliches and platitudes like, well, God has a reason and a purpose for your pain. All things work together for good for those who love God. Your pain can be a blessing if you just look at it from the right perspective. You'll be healed or stay sick to God's glory and his good purpose in your life. Now, ultimately, I believe all those things are true, right? Theologically, they're true. God can and he does work things for good. But even truth is not fully true when it's said in the wrong time or the wrong context. And so truth can be negated by the timing that we say it in. So we need to be very careful about that. I want to talk for a minute about what it truly takes to suffer with God and not without him. Robert Clemons calls that creative suffering. John 16:33, again, the whole verse this time. He says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Peace, with just one word, peace. Jesus quiets the quest of our soul. We thirst for peace, shalom, quietness, wholeness, stillness, rest, healing. Isn't that part of what we yearn for? He says, take heart, hope, come alive again. What do we generally desire? Peace, rest, and hope, right? And if we handle our sorrows through him, we also will overcome the world, as he says in this verse. When the fallen world has fallen on us, that's what we want. We want hope. We want that new life. We want that resurrected heart. The Apostle Paul also puts hoping and grieving together. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13, he says, but I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. In our fallen nature, we tend not to blend losses and healing, grieving, and hoping together. That's not our natural thing. We tend to focus on the losses and the grief, but to blend them together takes creative suffering. Another word for creative is productive, making it productive. To be successful in our suffering, we must allow it to create something new in our lives, to be productive in our lives. Frank Lake describes the process of creative suffering, and he says this: there is no human experience which cannot be put on the anvil of a lively relationship with God and man and battered into a meaningful shape. Notice what the anvil is: a lively relationship with God and a lively relationship with man, God's people. And notice the process here: battering. Notice the result: meaning and purpose. That's what comes out of it. What cannot be removed, God makes creatively bearable for us. Does anybody remember the name Terry Waite? He was an assistant for Anglican affairs for the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1980s. This is the time of the hostages. And he traveled to Lebanon to try to secure the release of 4 of the hostages. And he himself was kidnapped, and he was held captive from 1987 to 1991. That's 1,460 1,460 days in solitary confinement in a prison cell in Beirut. Can you imagine that? I mean, I can't even imagine that. After he was freed, and he reflected on that he had just savage mistreatment and a constant struggle to maintain his faith during all this time. Here's what he wrote. He said, I have been determined in captivity and still am determined to convert this experience into something that will be useful and good for other people. I think that's the way to approach suffering. It seems to me that Christianity doesn't in any way lessen suffering. What it does is enable you to take it, to face it, to work through it, and eventually convert it. Creative suffering doesn't simply accept suffering, but through the cross, it creatively converts it to something productive in our lives. So our goal here is to learn how to grieve, but not as those who have no hope. Does that sound impossible? Here's what the Bible says. Hebrews 5:8, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. Philippians 3:10 says that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. Learning obedience through suffering, knowing him in the fellowship of his suffering. There must be something to that. I'm going to look for just a minute at the way of suffering. Consider the contrast in the book of Genesis. In the first 5 words of Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created. First 5 words. And then the last 5 words of the book in Genesis 50:26, it says, in a coffin in Egypt. In the beginning, God created, and ends with in a coffin in Egypt. The Bible begins with life, but within 2 chapters, it introduces death as well. In fact, all but 4 chapters of the entire Bible, Genesis, which are Genesis 1 and 2, Revelation 21 and 22, address our slavery to death in some way or another in a coffin in Egypt. Given that 1,185 verses or chapters out of the 1,089 chapters in the Bible cover suffering and death, you would think that we would have a clear-cut theology of suffering. But the truth is we don't. We have theology, which is the study of the nature of God and religious beliefs. We have Christology for the study of Christ. We have anthropology for the study of human beings. We have angelology for the study of angels. But there seems to be no official sufferology, a biblical theology of suffering. In theology textbooks, they don't teach it. But what we've been studying in our class and in these chapters here is what the Bible really tells us to create a biblical sufferology. How do we suffer in a way that is productive, in a way that is creative in our lives? And we've been discovering a process that takes us from the hurting to the hope to the healing in God's way. Tonight, I want to look a little bit at some of the levels of suffering or the causes of grief. And then next week, we're going to talk about some of the stages, the 4 stages of sustaining and suffering, the stages of hurt, and then look toward the stages of healing. This is a definite process that we can go through. So why does suffering hurt so much? Martin Luther was a very perceptive student of suffering, both personally and theologically. And he found that we always experience suffering as a trial of faith. And he identified 2 different levels of faith trials. There's level 1 suffering, and this is basically what happens to and around us. That's what we're facing. That's the external stuff that we have to deal with, that we respond to internally. We lose our job, one of our kids gets sick, a spouse leaves, a good friend dies. Level 1 suffering involves our circumstances and our situations, what happens to us. But level 2 suffering is what happens in us. And that's how we face what it is we're dealing with out here. So we have the external things and we have the internal response to it. Level 2 suffering is the suffering of the mind that gives rise to fear and to doubt as we think about and reflect on our external suffering. So level 2 suffering is what happens in us as we face our circumstances. Do we doubt, fear, run away from God? Or do we trust and cling to him and face our suffering face to face with him? Remember, we have the choice. So level 2 consists of how we respond internally to our external situations. Much or most of what happens or what creates level 1 suffering, we have no control over or little control over. But level 2 suffering, that's where choice comes into play. And this is where the enemy loves to play with us, is in that level 2 suffering, that internal experience. So I want to explore a few things about level 1 suffering. Suffering is so dreadful and so painful because it's about death in some way or form or fashion. All suffering in some way or another is the dying or the separating or severing of relationships. Ultimately, we experience all suffering as death. Whether it's the huge death of a broken marriage or engagement, or the smaller death of a flat tire, or the grand death that ends our earthly life, we all face daily casket experiences. These casket journeys are not the way it was supposed to be. We're not meant to end up in a coffin in Egypt. Death is an intruder. In his book, Mourning into Dancing, Walter Wangerin has this insight. He says, death doesn't wait till the end of our lives to meet us and to make an end. Instead, we die 100 times before we die. And all the little endings on the way are like a slowly growing echo of the final bang before that bang takes place. Because our reality is relational, that's how God created us to be, in relationship, right? Then death is separation. All deaths, all caskets are the same in that respect, the sundering of relationships or the tearing apart of relationship in some form or fashion. Wangerin explains that suffering and death are meant to teach us our need again. Just as Paul outlines in 2 Corinthians 1, 8 and 9, it says, "For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God which raiseth the dead." In suffering, God is not getting back at us. He's getting us back to himself. The actual experience of dying persuades the little God in us, the little g God in us, that he is finite after all. Isn't that one of the things that kind of makes us a little uncomfortable when we face the death of a loved one or an acquaintance? Because it reminds us that we too someday will experience that we will face that death ourselves. Or one of the reasons we get kind of uncomfortable or get tongue-tied or when we come face to face with the suffering of other people. because it reminds us perhaps of times that we've suffered ourselves, or the fact that we may, in some sense, suffer in the same way. When Paul felt the sentence of death, he understood that his only hope was in a death-raising God. When we operate as though we're in charge and we are self-sufficient, we are really in trouble. And the primary purpose of our experiences of suffering is to help redirect us back to our Creator and our Savior, if we allow them to. Suffering essentially opens our hands to God. That's what it begins to do. Augustine said this: God wants to give us something, but cannot, because our hands are full. There's nowhere for him to put it. I read that just recently, and it was interesting because I'd never heard of that quote before. But some years back, I was praying. I don't remember what I was praying about. It may have been that kind of whining prayer at that point. Something wasn't going the way I wanted it to. I don't remember exactly what it was, but God very clearly said to me, I have diamonds to give you, but your hands are full of gravel. And it really spoke to me about how we hang on to things that really ultimately have no meaning and no real purpose in our lives. And God has so much more for us. But when we fill ourselves up with the mundane and with the little things that are meaningless, he can't give us what he wants to give us. And so suffering opens our hands and allows him to be able to pour into us because we are emptying ourselves out. Moses taught the same truth in the passage that Jesus quoted during his temptation in the desert. Why does God allow us to have desert wanderings in our lives? According to Deuteronomy 8 and Matthew 4, it's to humble us and to teach us how desperately needy we are. In Deuteronomy 8:2 it says, and thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. God knew what was in their hearts. He didn't have to wonder. He wanted them to know what was in their hearts. And that's one of the things here that happens to us. Matthew 4 is also the story of Jesus being taken into the wilderness to fast and then be tempted of the devil. And in that instance, Jesus, the man, humbled himself and refused to display for Satan the power he could have. Our greatest need is eternal life, and we will experience that eternal life in intimacy with God. Our suffering actually reveals God's extraordinary love, because without that suffering, we would forget God and our need for him. Just think about this. Isn't there a difference between how much you pray when things are going well in your life and when you're in the middle of a trial? Isn't there a difference in how you pray when things are going well in your life or when you're in the middle of a trial? It's really so true. It's our hardest times that really put us on our knees. It just seems to be our human nature. Suffering actually is a form of God's grace. It was grace that barred Adam and Eve from the tree of life. Because if they had gotten to that tree and gotten a hold of it and lived forever as immortal, immoral beings, they would have never faced their need for God. God loves us too much to allow us to forget our neediness. Just as we love our children too much to let them play on the freeway. And he makes therapeutic use of our suffering. Suffering causes us to groan for home and to live in hope, just as Hebrews 11 tells us. In verse 1 of Hebrews 11, we all know this, probably could quote it. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things what? Not seen. In verses 13 through 16 in that same chapter, and he's talking about the heroes of faith, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from which they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. God refuses to allow us to get too comfortable here. He allows us suffering. He allows those daily casket processionals that we have, so we will cry out to him. We will recognize that we need him. Suffering reminds us that we're not home yet, and that we, the limited, must reach for him, the unlimited, and we must depend on him. At least that's God's intent. But the enemy plots something very different than that. And that's what we learn about in the area of level 2 suffering, which is the battlefield of the mind, essentially. So level 2 suffering, again, is what happens in us. The theological reality of suffering teaches us that our world is fallen and it often falls on us. But the personal reality of suffering tutors us in the truth that our world is a mess, and it often messes with our minds. Suffering is not only what happens to us, but it's also, and more importantly, what happens in us. All suffering and mourning amount to a sense of death or divorce or aloneness and forsakenness. The doubts that we endure while we're in the casket of suffering lead to a potential break in our relationship to God, to others, and to ourselves, so that we end up feeling several things here. Number one, spiritual abandonment. I feel forsaken. Number two, social betrayal. I feel betrayed. And number three, self-contempt. I feel ashamed. In that first stage, spiritual abandonment, I feel forsaken. In that stage, we can see God as our enemy. Why are you doing this to me? We read about it, especially in Job, several of the Psalms, Jeremiah, Lamentations. Martin Luther called this aspect of level 2 suffering, he called it spiritual depression. It's the trial of faith that's produced when we think about and interpret our suffering with human reasoning rather than by faith. If we try to reason our way through the experiences that we're having, we're not seeing them through the eyes of faith. It's a state of mind where we believe maybe that God is against us, or in the sense of that ultimate terror, that he's completely abandoned us and forsaken us. So the presence of suffering can result in an absence of faith. We can also call this kind of spiritual separation anxiety, kind of that terrifying sense of abandonment. And Satan incites this kind of terror when he whispers to us, life is bad, and God controls life, so he must be bad too. Or how can you trust his heart? He's left you all alone again. Those are the kinds of things the enemy tries to tell us. So both spiritual depression and spiritual separation anxiety are caused by our internal interpretation of external events, the way we look at them. Satan's strategy is to provoke us to misinterpret what's going on here and see them through faithless eyes or through human reasoning. He did that with Eve, and he does that with us. He uses the same strategy. in the presence of external suffering, the absence of faith in God's goodness and his purposes leads us to a terrified conscience that sees God as angry and evil instead of loving and good. Jeremiah felt and expressed that same kind of thing in Lamentations 5:20. He says, "Why do you always forget us? Why do you forsake us for so long?" In Jeremiah 20:7, his language is even stronger here. "O Lord, you deceived me, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed." So he's experienced that sense of spiritual abandonment here. Heman, who was considered one of the wisest believers, it's mentioned in 1 Kings 4:31, wrote Psalm 88, which is the psalm that's known as the dark night of the soul. And he concludes the psalm in verse, 18, by saying, "You have taken my companions and loved ones from me. The darkness is my closest friend." So you see that same kind of feeling that's going on here. That all sounds pretty dismal, doesn't it? But haven't we all felt that kind of way at some time or another? We might not have said it in those exact words, or we might not have said it out loud. But in times of suffering, many times we have those same kinds of experiences. Maybe the feeling of being abandoned or maybe duped in some way or another. And then the next stage is social betrayal. I feel betrayed. So we feel abandoned by God, and then it continues on to a sense of social betrayal. We learn that we can't live without trusting other people. But we also learn that in trusting other people, we will have betrayal in our lives, right? Joseph is a great example of that. He faced betrayal on every side. He was betrayed by his brothers, by the slave traders, by Potiphar's wife, by Potiphar himself, by the baker. Joseph had every opportunity to let that consume him and turn him into a bitter man. He didn't have the book that he could go to the end of the book and say, "Oh, I know how this is going to turn out, and I'm going to be on top of things." He didn't have that. He had no idea how it was going to turn out. But he wrestled through that face to face with God and came out with it being a creative experience for him. David certainly knew betrayal as well. He describes it here in Psalm 55 in verses 12 through 14. "If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were raising himself against me, I could hide from him. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship as we walked through the throng at the house of God." Who of us has not said or felt similar things in our lives? Who of us has not shed similar tears in our experiences? So, after the sense of spiritual abandonment and then the social betrayal, we finally come to self-contempt. I feel ashamed. We come to the conclusion that if God has rejected me and others have rejected me, then I must really be unworthy. There must really be something wrong with me. I'm not only at fault, I am faulty. Job loathed his very life in Job 10:1. He says, "My soul is weary of my life. I will leave my complaint upon myself. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul." He lost all hope for himself in all of this and his future. And in 17:11, he says, "My days are past, my plans are shattered, and so are the desires of my heart." So he felt stripped of honor, he felt torn down, hope uprooted. And in 19:9 and 10, he says, "He hath stripped me of my glory and taken the crown from my head. He hath destroyed me on every side, and I am gone. And mine hope hath he removed like a tree." He was contemptuous toward himself, and that's what begins to happen. God has abandoned us. I can't trust other people. There must be something really wrong with me. So here we are in times of suffering. We are in a coffin in Egypt. We're confused, feeling abandoned and betrayed. We're hurting and we're not sure what to do next. So I'm going to basically leave it at that. Next week, we're going to talk about stages of hurt and stages of hope, because there is a process that we go through and stages that we can go through in this whole thing that can essentially create that and produce those things in our lives and in our hearts, to where we will not hold in the things that end up damaging us so badly. If we do not process through the events in our lives, whether it's a little disappointment or a huge betrayal, if we do not process through those things appropriately in God's way, they end up weighing us down and holding us down and keeping us from what we could possibly do and be. And so this process is very, very valuable in helping us in every stage of life that we go through. So what do we do when we are assailed outside and in? How are we to survive, much less thrive? In the middle of these things, we're wondering just how can we survive? We're not often thinking, how am I going to thrive as a result of this? When we're overwhelmed by circumstances and feeling condemned by God, our friends, and our own soul, how do we manage that? How do we move from just suffering to creative suffering? How does God expect us to find hope when we're hurting? How do we wrestle and suffer face to face with God rather than turning our back on Him during these times? When tragedy occurs and pain invites itself in, we enter a crisis of faith. And we will either move toward God or away from Him. And so how can we assure that we will move toward Him? And those are some of the things that we'll begin to talk about next week. How do we take these experiences? Again, we all have them. How do we take these experiences and walk through them in a way that we don't turn our back on God? We could, every one of us, probably make a list of people that we know that have been in the midst of these kinds of circumstances, and they essentially turned away from God and walked away. Right? We don't want that to happen to us, people we love, or even to them. And so part of it, how do we walk through it? How do we learn to go through that process? And how do we learn to reach out to people that we see around us that are going through these experiences? So, thank you so much for your attention. I think I ended maybe 2 minutes early. So, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. 3 minutes early, Tyson says. Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Thank you so much.